So, we're going to be discussing Chapter 4 of the book, Introducing Hinduism, and on page 89, there is a list of, actually I should have written that, what are called the Purusharthas, or the Purusha means sort of human person, and the goals of life, that human beings are motivated, and in the course of normal human life, they're motivated by and they pursue basically four goals. And so we can analyze human civilization in terms of the pursuit of these four goals, and of course, a culture which is normative. In other words, a culture which declares what is the right way to live and what is the wrong way to live, will have views on these things. And so these four goals of human life, which sometimes are given like in a progressive sequence, are Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. And we'll give an example of this sequence from American colonial history. Anyway, Dharma. Dharma means duty or virtue. And as we've learned, there are different kinds of dharma. There's Varna Dharma. In other words, if someone is a Brahmana, a Kshatriya, Vaishya, or Shudra, there are certain duties. There are certain duties for each one of those Varnas. And then there's ashram duties. There are ashram duties. For example, brahmachari, celibate students, just as at the University of Florida, almost, most of the students are celibate. And so ashram dharma means that when one is a celibate student, there are certain special duties that one has to perform, certain religious duties and social duties. Or when you get married. I mean, we have that in our culture. At least when you get married, if you have a child, you have certain legal obligations to your children. So, whether you call it legal obligations or dharma, it's the same idea. That this was the concept of this civilization of what a person's natural obligations are at different stages of life. And there are kula dharmas, which are mentioned in the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, family duties. So it's a very different notion of life. We in modern times tend to have the idea that life is meant to enjoy. Like that's a common thing people say to each other, like enjoy. And there's a notion that we're here in this world as pleasure-seeking creatures. We're here to have a good time, to seek pleasure, to seek personal satisfaction. And the notion here is that essentially we are on earth to fulfill certain duties, and that by doing so, we will actually be happy. This is a common theme that runs throughout Buddhism and Jainism and Vedanta tradition, the yoga tradition. It's a very common thing that, there's one statement in the Bhagavatam that says, Sanskrit Jatha Taror Mula Nishechanena. Just as by watering the root of a tree, you water a tree's roots, this is like Botany 1A, you water the root of a tree and you nourish all the branches and leaves and fruits or flowers of the tree. So in the same way, the idea is that God, not for Buddhists perhaps, but for most of these traditions, God is the root of our existence, just as a tree grows from its roots. The idea, remember the first statement of the Brahma Sutras, Janmadhyasya Jataha, the absolute truth is that from which everything emanates. That was in the Upanishads, Jito va imani bhutani jayante, that from which all creatures are born, and Jatani jivanti, and once born live, and ultimately return back to their source. So this idea of a source of all existence, a root of all existence, so that it is by watering that root that you actually nourish your own existence. And in fact, as Buddhism teaches, that those are the Four Noble Truths, that the reason we're suffering is because we are trying to enjoy. And this is perhaps the great irony of the universe, according to these traditions, that the more we try to selfishly enjoy, the more we actually suffer, the more we're in anxiety. When we let go of this selfishness and try to do our duty with devotion and with goodness and consideration, we actually become happy. Another example is given that by feeding the stomach, you feed your entire body. The different limbs of the body cannot separately eat. Like your hand, you may have like the world's most powerful hand. You may be able to like crush iron in your bare hands, but you still can't eat through your hand. The hand has to put the food in the stomach. So that's the idea. It's by giving. And we even in English we say it's better to give than to receive. This also gets back to something we discussed from the 3rd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. The notion of a cosmic cycle, that we're receiving different gifts, and in the process of offering back. There's one nice song by George Harrison, Forgetting to Give Back. What is the song? I don't know if you know George Harrison, but anyway, the song is Isn't It a Pity? And one of the lines is people are, forgetting to give back. So this notion of giving back, of receiving and giving back, this cycle of sacrifice, and we also discussed in the Gita that it's only by sacrifice, by offering, that one can escape karma. Because the basic cause of karma is that we're trying to grab material things. We're trying to possess matter, which is really not possessible. It already belongs to someone. For example, in the Upanishad, one of the earliest Upanishads, and actually the only Upanishad which is directly part of an original Vedic text. It's part of the Yajurveda. So this Upanishad, which literally means the Upanishad of the Lord, one of the oldest Upanishads, it has a special prestige because doesn't come after a Vedic text. It actually is one of the original texts of the Vedas. And so the Isha Upanishad, it's called the Isha Upanishad, the Lord Upanishad, because the first word in the Upanishad is Lord. It begins with the statement, Isha Vasimidang Sarvam, that the entire universe should be seen as the dwelling place of the Lord. The Lord dwells within everything, and therefore it's understood is the proprietor of everything. So how does it go? Everything within the universe actually is pervaded by the Lord, and therefore tena tyatena bhunjita. One should enjoy, or one should try to possess only that which has been set aside as our quota. The idea being that everyone is allotted. Like animals, for example, they don't have bank accounts or credit cards, but most animals under normal environmental circumstances, when human beings aren't trashing the planet, most animals and insects and birds and fish and so on basically get what they need, and the idea is that everyone is allotted what they need, but one should never encroach upon the property of another. One should never take more than one's quota. Anyway, we all know those statistics of what percentage Americans are of the world population, what percentage of the world's resources they enjoy. We all know those numbers. So, anyway, you have these basic understandings of who we are, what our place is within the universe. And the idea that somehow the universe, or even a part of it, could become our property is considered to be ultimately absurd. Because we have a very temporary existence in this world. And the idea, or for example, the idea that another soul can belong to me. You know this basic psychology. People become possessive in relationships. And so the basic idea that one soul could become the property of another soul, either through slavery or emotional attachment, whatever, ultimately would be considered impossible. Or really, ultimately, the idea that even one atom of the universe could really be my property. We saw in the Gita that we are considered in the Gita to be the energy of God, one of the energies of God, and matter is another energy. So these are like sister energies. And I use the term sister because the words for energy are feminine in Sanskrit, Shakti or Prakriti. So anyway, that's the underlying metaphysic. That's the underlying understanding of what the universe is, what our place is in it, and what it means to behave in a normal, natural, healthy way as a living being within the universe, considering who we are and what the world is. And so therefore, the first notion is Dharma. I already told you where anyway, etymology, never mind etymology for now. So, now, the idea is that if one really practices Dharma, if you're really a good person, if you're virtuous, do your duty and all that, you'll be prosperous. I mean, this is certainly the idea in the Old Testament. that God rewards those who are virtuous and so on. And artha means prosperity. Prosperity can mean money also. And if you are prosperous, then you have facility under normal circumstances to satisfy your desires. So people cultivate virtue, they become prosperous, they satisfy their desires, and once you kind of went through your little material wish list, then the idea is that bright people will figure out, okay, I got what I wanted, and I'm still not perfectly satisfied. There is more to life than this, and they seek liberation. Whoops. There it is, moksha. Liberation. And that's why the Brahma Sutras, the Vedanta, the Brahma Sutras begin with that statement, with the first word, actually it's two words, euphonically combined. Ataha, now therefore, the desire to know the absolute truth. Atatu Brahma Jigyasa. And traditionally, for a very long time, scholars of Vedanta in India have analyzed this very first word of the Brahma Sutra, Satato, now therefore, as meaning you've gone through this stuff, Dharma, Artha, Kama. You've gone through that, and you've realized that there's more to life. Very sort of shrewdly, commentators for many, many centuries, going back a very long time, have realized, like, how can you start a book with the word therefore? Because therefore, in Sanskrit or English, means, well, it's a conclusion. Like, given this, given that, given the other thing, you lay out your premises. Therefore, whatever. Therefore introduces a conclusion. So how can you begin a book with the word therefore? And they responded that the work begins with the word therefore because it's understood. Therefore, now that you've gone through the preliminary program, and now you're ready for liberation. So this is basically the structure. This is the way human civilization is conceived of, and this cuts across many, many, many different sectarian boundaries. All different kinds of, well, not all, but most types of Hinduism, most philosophies within India, even Buddhist, Jains, everyone kind of sees this as making sense at some level. They may disagree on what the moksha is, what the liberation is, but everyone kind of agrees that this is the way human life is structured. See, what else do I want to say? Oh yeah, about this. There is a very important term called Sanatana Dharma. In fact, this is one of the historical ways that Hindus have described themselves. The word Hindu is somewhat recent, somewhat modern. And so one of the common ways that people who follow the Vedas, or try to, one of the ways they refer to themselves is as Sanatan Dharmis, those who follow Sanatan Dharma. And Sanatan Dharma means eternal Dharma. Eternal Dharma. The idea being that, for example, Varna Dharma. If you practice a certain Dharma, let's say, because you are a Brahmana, or a Kshatriya, or Vaishya Shudra, you only practice that Dharma because that's the kind of body you got in this life. You were born with a Brahminical body in terms of your propensities, your nature, or in somewhat corrupted Vedic society according to your birth, which of course is not mentioned in the Gita. But it's your body. So in a sense, if you took another birth as something else, you'd have a different Dharma. Or your ashram Dharma. When you are a celibate student, then you have brahmachari Dharma. If you get married, then it's grihastha Dharma, and then so on. The different ashrams. Then you retire as a vanaprastha, you may renounce as a sannyasi. But the idea is that all the varna Dharma and the ashram Dharma is about your body. It's based on what, the state of your body at a particular time in your life or in a particular incarnation of yours. So when you get to the Dharma of your soul, it's like, well, what is the duty of my soul? Not because I'm a man or a woman or a king or a Brahmin or a worker, not because I'm married or not married or whatever, but what is my Dharma just because I'm a soul? What is the duty of the soul itself? And when you start looking into that, that's Sanatana Dharma, the eternal Dharma of the soul. There's also, I wrote this 1866, It's not simply a date. That's a Bhagavad Gita verse. It's the last chapter, one of the last verses of the Gita, and one of the most famous ones, where Krishna says, Sarva Dharman Parityajya Mamekam Sharanam Vraja, which in Sanskrit means giving up all dharmas, come to me alone for shelter. And so the idea is that, especially in the Bhakti tradition, certainly in the Gita, that we perform our dharmas as brahmanas, kshatriyas, married, single, whatever. We do that stuff not because it directly liberates us, but because it, so to speak, civilizes our bodies. It keeps our bodies within reasonable boundaries so that we don't get out of control and do something which will harm ourselves or other people. There's I often give this example, there's an interesting sign they put on all the highways in Brazil. There's a few people here from Brazil, at least one. Anyone else here from Brazil? No. Oh well. Trust me, they really have this on the highways in Brazil. They have these signs that say, in Portuguese, quem obedece a sinalização evita acidentes, which means that those who follow the traffic signs avoid accidents. And if you think about it, let's say in a rational state where the people in charge of transportation are not insane or incompetent, well, we'll talk about the traffic lights in Gainesville. But if you live in a place where the traffic signs, the speed limits and the right-of-ways and all that stuff has been reasonably set up, if everyone follows all the rules under normal conditions, like it's not, a huge storm when cars are skidding all over the place, but under normal conditions, if everyone follows the rules, there will be no accidents. That's why they make the rules that way, to avoid accidents. So they say in Brazil, those who obey the traffic signs avoid accidents. And the Varnashram system is something like that. It's an attempt to organize human society so that it works together harmoniously and so that people can satisfy their desires, not become frustrated and crazy, satisfy their desires, and yet at the same time, in a way, satisfy their desires in a way that keeps them on the spiritual path. And that's the basic idea. So, for example, a teacher, even in America, there's all kinds of rules for teachers. I've never really read all of them, but there are laws against sexual harassment. There are laws against you can't give someone a good grade because they paid you some money, or to teach in a university you have to have certain qualifications. Anyway, so there are certain standards. That there's a Dharma. The idea is that in every society, they may not use the word, but they have a Dharma for these things. So in America, there's a whole set of rules and qualifications and standards governing the teaching profession, pedagogy, at different levels. Or there are rules for marriage. For example, if you do certain things are considered very obnoxious and maybe grounds for divorce. Certain things are actually criminal within a marital relationship. And so if you think about it, within our culture also, there are rules governing the different stages of life. We just don't call it Dharma. So Dharma is simply the way this civilization organized human life so that, in their view, people could progress as far as possible on the spiritual path. Now, inevitably, as we discussed last time, people who are, again, within this conception, people who are very attached to their messages running my clock. People who are attached to their bodies are going to take the dharmas as somehow final, and they're going to sort of, forget this moksha thing. So that, let's say someone really doesn't identify themselves as a soul. Someone really takes their body, like, this is me, I'm this body, and therefore, since I have a Brahman body, I really am a Brahman. I really am a Brahman. And therefore, the duties I perform as a Brahman are my eternal duties, because this is really who I am. I'm a Brahman. There's a great spiritual figure we'll study toward the end of the course, Chaitanya, Sri Chaitanya, who made the statement he was a sannyasi. He was born as a Brahman, and so his varna was a Brahman, his ashram was a sannyasi. So he was at the top of the heap on both scores, and yet he said, I'm not a Brahmin or a Kshatriya or a Vaishya Shudra. I'm not a sannyasi or a whatever. On the grounds that these things refer to my body. He said, actually, I'm the eternal servant of the servant of the servant of God. But I perform these different duties simply because they correspond to my external situation. It's interesting because there's always been this tension. We saw with Buddhism and Jainism. There's always been this tension about social hierarchy. And there always is, even in America. I mean, that's what a lot of the change was about in the recent political campaign. People felt that there was a certain type of political and economic hierarchy that was becoming oppressive in different ways, unjust. And so there's always in society a tendency for people on top to kind of squash the people beneath them, or to take advantage of their position on top of the pile, to act for their own advantage, the advantage of their families and friends. Charles Dickens wrote a lot of books about this. So there's always this tension. And yet, if you go to the other extreme, if you try to have a classless society, which the Buddhists attempted unsuccessfully, which the Marxists attempted very unsuccessfully, that was just a secular attempt to get rid of a caste system. Actually, when Marx was writing, although the Industrial Revolution had dramatically wiped out a lot of the old feudal system and hereditary caste system in Europe, still, a lot of it was left. I mean, in Europe, I think even to this day, your last name is more important than it is in America. So if you have it, and yet when you go to the other extreme, classless, like I said, class society doesn't work. So that the Buddhists, very early on, the Buddhists were preaching to, appealing to, and very happily accepting the patronage of royalty, of kings. And you're not going to bite the hand that feeds you. So that if some prince or king or queen gives you a big donation and you can build a little monastery in your hometown, you're not going to go around saying, you're not really a king, by the way, and you really shouldn't tell anyone what to do. No, you're going to say, thanks a lot, Maharaj. We'll put your name in the, put your name on the building. And inevitably, the Buddhists did not do away with Brahmins. They just redefined the qualifications. They said, well, a Brahmin is not someone that just is born like this or performs that ritual as on the Vedic side, but a Brahmin is someone that does this. So they ended up with Kshatriyas and Brahmins. They ended up with Kshatriyas and Brahmins, and as far as the two lower classes, Vaishyas and Shudras, management never wants to be confused with labor, right? So the people who are the Vaishyas, they're management. They own the companies, or they own the farm. They don't want to be confused with their own workers. Even if they are all Buddhists, this is still my land, and you're still working on my land, and I'm paying you. So yeah, we're all Buddhists, and that's all great, but you work for me. And don't get too Buddhist on me and forget who's in charge here. So basically it all came roaring back. So no one has successfully obliterated social hierarchy. I mean, you can try if you like and tell us how it goes, but for thousands of years there's been movements to do it. It just never works because it just always bounces back. Like that clown, you keep punching it down, it keeps bouncing back. On the other hand, so if you assume, looking at history, that some kind of social hierarchy, because some people are smarter than other people, some people are stronger than other people, some people are much better at business, some people are more beautiful. I mean, there are different natural hierarchies, and you can say that people who are smarter or richer or stronger should just act as if they're not and should just understand that spiritually we're all the same, and in no way, no matter how much money you have, in no way live in a nicer house or treat the people under you as if they're not under you. I mean, in the real world, it doesn't happen that much. You may get a saint that does it. You may get who was that king, Saint Louis, right? We have a Saint Louis in America. There was a king, Louis of France, who apparently washed the feet of the poor and the beggars. He was the king of France, and yet he was trying to follow Jesus. And if you know Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, sort of like the beatification of Jean Valjean, even though he has all this money and so on, how he gradually sort of achieves a type of sainthood. And so, I mean, there are saints in the world, you could say. There are people who take spiritual principles very, very seriously. But most people are just sort of works in progress. They're just kind of doing the best they can, and they don't get too extreme about these things. So there's always this tension because you have the spiritual principle that we're all one. We're all one. We're all just souls, or from the Buddhist point of view, we're all potential bodhisattvas or Buddhas in the making. Or from the Jain point of view, we're all just eternal jivas. As I said, from the Vedanta point of view, we're all eternal souls. The Bhakti point of view, we're all eternal servants of God. And so you have that, and yet you have this social hierarchy, and the degree to which a society tends to go to the hierarchy side is the degree to which, in a sense, people are selfish, people are vain, they take the body to be the self, and I've got a better body than you do, and that's your tough luck, and I'm going to make the most of it. And you could say the extent to which people take the soul seriously, or their Buddha nature, or whatever, or they take seriously that we're all servants of God, or we're all children of God, the extent to which they take that seriously, this tends to moderate the hierarchy so that people can actually sort of have some type of unity and harmony and really respect each other, despite the fact that there are these inevitable differences in material abilities and material fortunes. And so it's precisely this tension. You find it in every society. For example, there's a program at Harvard where they study the gap in America historically between the rich and the poor. And you'll be very pleased to know that the gap it's one of the widest points in history right now, which leads to an unstable social order. So that's very encouraging. But, of course, we've had a regime change. I guess we had a leader that always talked about regime change, and then I guess be careful what you talk about. So, anyway, so now the question is, can this gap be somehow be reduced? If you go to Europe, one thing you may notice if you go to Scandinavia or even England, other Western European countries, is that you simply don't find the extraordinary displays of wealth that you find in America, like some elderly couple, 6,000 square foot home or something, living by themselves, and you also don't find all the kind of like shocking poverty. I mean, America is, historically, and I don't mean this as a condemnation. It's just, I think, sort of a neutral observation. It is a country that still very strongly has this feeling of social Darwinism, sort of survival of the fittest. And, we're on an equal playing field. I just made more money than you did, and that's the way it goes. I mean, there's some truth to that, but so this gap between the rich and the poor, and what historians claim is that when the gap gets very wide in America, in Rome, in India, wherever, there's more tension and the society is less stable. When there is more moderation, so you don't have so many extremes of wealth and poverty, the society is actually more stable, and in a sense, things go better. Of course, you may say this is propaganda coming from liberal historians at Harvard, but anyway, that's what they say. So, so in India, it's the same tension, and that's one of the points I wanted to make in this course. This is not just about India. This is about human life, and you find this in every society. In every society, these tensions between sort of the wisdom that tells us we're all one and the so-called pragmatism that tells us that, hey, I just made more money than you and I'm not really unhappy about it. Or I just won the war and you lost the war, and, to the winner go the spoils. So, whether it's an economic war, a political war, a military war, whatever. So this tension. So the caste system, you have a caste system, and then you have this principle of oneness. So there's tremendous tension here. On the one hand, you have all these great traditions, Vedanta, Jainism, Buddhism, these very powerful traditions claiming there's a oneness. Now, like Shankara may go all the way and say it's really totally one, or everybody else may say there is variety, but still we're one. We're all souls. We're all Buddhas in the making. We're all jivas, whatever. And then this very strict caste system, this very steep caste system, which got steeper and steeper. So there's a lot of tension there. And you find it everywhere in the world, certainly including America, in different forms. And Dharma, in a sense, is trying to deal with this and trying to civilize human beings. So any questions on these points? Yes?
Are we going through these stages in one lifetime or many lifetimes, or we find ourselves like in
This stuff here?
Yeah.
Well, presumably a person... Oh, I mentioned the American colonies. I'll just do that real quick and then I'll... At least the, the pilgrims... I mean, it's interesting because a pilgrim is someone's on pilgrimage, They're called the pilgrims. The Puritans. Think of these names. The pilgrims. They came to America as a religious pilgrimage to build a city on a hill because Europe was becoming decadent by... At that time, they had this sudden new religious diversity in Europe after the Reformation, where Europe kind of, the United Kingdom of Christ on earth dissolved into all these different forms of Christianity. And some people felt that all the other forms of Christianity were hopelessly mistaken. And so they came to the New World to purify Christianity, or on pilgrimage to build a new city on a hill as a beacon to show the world the real way. So definitely when the people, actually Harvard, at the entrance to Harvard, there's the old entrance, they engraved in stone these words from the journal of the first governor, I think, of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they founded Harvard something like 20 years after they landed. I mean, they had landed and there was, they sort of start from scratch. And including, cutting trees down to put a roof over your head. It was pretty basic. And 20 years later, they were founding a university. And one of the reasons was that they happened to be one of the most highly educated communities in Europe, the people that came over. And as part of their religious approach, it's interesting because before, in Catholicism, you just listened to what the priest said. But once you make this, they have the printing press, and everyone's got their own Bible. You can read the Bible in your own language. Then you've got to really study very hard, be very intelligent, scholarly, to figure out what it really means. Anyway, so they had all this education thing going on. And the reason they founded Harvard is because they feared that, the way they put it is, that now that God brought us safely over the ocean, and now that we've taken care of the very basic things, we've got a roof over our head and things like that, and some food to eat, they said it is natural that we next thought of education, because we want to guarantee to the next generation a learned clergy. Because that's why I founded Harvard. Anyway, to have a learned clergy. So there was all this concern with Dharma, like what is our religious duty and how can we be virtuous? People were very concerned about those things back then, even if they didn't always get it clear. And America became very prosperous. You have these people founding America who are seriously concerned about what's the real religion and what's our real duty and what is virtue. America becomes very prosperous. All kinds of self-gratification breaks out, the consumerist society. And some people becoming frustrated with all this then begin to think, well, what does it all mean ultimately? And where am I really going? And who am I? Where do I come from? And so on and so forth. How can I become free? So, you can see, even in American history, you can see a type, just very crudely, a type of progression. As far as taking one life, hopefully a person in this life will to some extent be concerned with virtue and to some extent have prosperity, something. Not live in a sort of a tissue box their whole life. And as far as desire, most people are able to satisfy some of their desires, and ultimately many people have some concern on some level with where they're going when they check out here. So, obviously the extent to which you emphasize one or the other, some people are all about Kama. There's even a Kama Sutra. There's a book that sort of focuses on that. Some people are just about gratifying themselves. Some people cultivate virtue. Some people are all about money. Some people focus on liberation. Ultimately, you could argue that there should be a sort of balance in these things. You don't go, hog wild for one or the other, but have a certain balance in your life. So, I don't know. That's the way I see it from common sense analysis. Any other questions on these points? I did prepare some notes. So, upside down. What else? Sanskaras. There's a Sanskrit word samskara, which is sort of a big idea in Hinduism, and I mean all the Indian religions really. They all do this. Samskara, the kara part just means doing or making, from the same root from which you get like create, which you get the English word create, and so on. And some means sort of fully or completely, and it's the Greek zoo, which we pronounce sim, like synthesis. You know, the complete thesis, the together thesis, the synthesis. That's just Sanskrit sun. So sort of doing things right, doing things completely. It's sanskara, and the S is just because I thought it sounds better that way. Anyway, so there are basic sanskaras that have to be performed, and we do that. I mean, you certainly have in Jewish culture and Christian culture, Muslim culture. They're basically rites of passage. These are just the les rites de passage. These are just the rites of passage. Like when a child is born, many people in many different traditions feel that when my child is born, I want to do whatever I can to get blessings for this child. That in addition to swaddling the little thing and feeding the little thing, you want to somehow get blessings for the child. In whatever religion people participate in, they want to somehow or other get divine protection, divine blessings for their child. Or, for example, when the child goes off to school, they may somehow ceremonialize that, or when you graduate from school. And they have special things in Hinduism, like you first cut the hair. The child is born, the hair grows, and you get these little wild frontier things for a little while. And they finally cut the hair, and that's ceremonialized. So these are just rites of passage. Marriage is like an obvious one. Marriage is an obvious one. And also, just like Catholics have, or Christians have confirmation, and Jews have bar mitzvahs, and everybody's got something. The idea is that when a child is a child, which basically means pre-puberty, when a child's a child, in most societies, or in somewhat functional families, the child goes along with the family program, like, come on, Billy, come on, Susie, we're going to church now, we're going to the synagogue, going to the mandir, and so on. And so children tend to just normally go along with their parents. When you hit that, that magic moment called puberty, then people start to physically mature, and their brains start to mature in very dangerous, subversive ways, and they start to think, which is extremely subversive, to be discouraged by all means. So, anyway, so the idea is that every civilization wants to somehow, at that moment when the child is becoming a youth, with new desires and new powers of thinking and a stronger will, they want to somehow or other head the kid off at the past and keep the kid in the civilization, like within what the parents and the elders consider to be civilized life, so the child doesn't go off the deep end in response to these new physical reality. And so about that age, at about the age when puberty really starts to become undeniable, it's a rite of passage. So you can pass safely and decently and in a civilized way, keeping the faith into this new physical and intellectual, mental phase of your life. So bar mitzvah, confirmation, whatever you call it. And in India, they have stuff like that too. So the sanskaras are just, the marriages, the bar mitzvahs, the birth ceremonies, the funerals. It's just all this stuff that everybody does in their own way to try to keep human life on track. And all these rites of passage make sure that when you pass through the passage, when you come out the other end, you're still a civilized human being, and you haven't forgotten your spiritual tradition. That's the basic idea. So it's a pretty universal thing. Those are the sanskaras. There's one remark in our textbook, Introducing Hinduism, page 81. Marriage marks a girl's entrance into spiritual life. That may be true among certain Hindu thinkers, but it's certainly not true in the spiritual traditions of India. And it's basically just not true in general of Indian religions, because what you see is, from a very, very early age, young children, boys or girls, are in many, many ways, at least up until recently, India now is becoming urbanized and industrialized and secularized and everythingized. But up until very recently in India, little children, boy or girl, they were told all kinds of spiritual stories. Again, I think this chapter is a little bit tilted toward technical rituals that aren't at the heart of things anymore for many centuries. So little children, boys and girls, they hear the spiritual stories, they hear Ramayana, Mahabharata, they take part in kirtans, they chant names of God. And so in many traditional Hindu families, even little, just very little kids, they're going very strong in their spiritual lives long, long before they're married, in families that take these things seriously. So the idea that a woman can't begin her spiritual life until she's married, I think, struck me as kind of, what? It's, anyway. Again, there are certain technical, Brahminical things that in the real world no one takes that seriously. So, you'll be very glad to know that by taking this course, you've learned that a man should not marry a girl with red hair or with too much or too little bodily hair. So the men in the course will be very happy if they were saved from possible tragic mistake by learning that. As far as what this stuff is about, I think every society develops its own idiosyncrasies and eccentricities. And ultimately, on the spiritual path, people didn't take these things that seriously. That's one thing you should always keep in mind. There's always a tension. There's always been a tension, which you can study about, at least for thousands of years, between people that were totally into all these technical and often very eccentric and idiosyncratic rules, and other people, I think the majority is on the other side, who really were about bhakti. In other words, devotion, hearing the Ramayana, hearing the Mahabharata, hearing these stories and trying to cultivate love and devotion. And the more seriously people took devotion, the more they took themselves as spiritual beings, the less they believed these things or took them very seriously. So that's another one of the tensions you find in every society. The people between, the tension between sort of the metaphysical technocrats and the people that are cultivating spirituality. In our society, there's this cliche, there's this sort of hackneyed thing where this tension between religiosity and spirituality. People say, well, I'm not very religious, but I think I'm a spiritual person. And so what does that mean? If you take in that jargon, religious means that I don't follow all the technical rules, I may not go to all the rituals and so on and so forth, but I think I'm basically a good person and I think my heart's in the right place and I have some serious interest in figuring out what it all means. So, in that sense, if spirituality means a certain state of consciousness, a certain disposition or predisposition towards virtue, towards kindness, towards wisdom, as opposed to technical adherence to all kinds of rules, many of which don't make a tremendous amount of sense. So this, I'm not religious but I'm spiritual thing, you also find in India. In fact, this whole Shramana thing was about that. The Shramanas were the original people that said, I may not be very religious, but I'm spiritual. And off they went into the wilderness. So again, these are perennial tensions. Oneness and hierarchy, let's say technical religiosity as opposed to spirituality and wisdom. And just as you can also go to extremes on this side. You can become so technical. There's stories throughout human civilization about sort of hypocritical religious people, like very strict, technical, frustrated priests that aren't kind, that actually aren't nice to people, but they're very strict. There's a million stories like that. But then on the other side, there are people that claim to be spiritual and are actually, according to normal standards, immoral. Or like, claiming to be a guru, I seduced that woman, but it was actually spiritual. And if you say that, I shouldn't have done that, well, that's just some technical religious hang-up. And so There was a very prominent scholar, Houston Smith, who wrote that book on world religions, which at least in the 20th century was used in zillions of college classes. Anyway, he wrote an article making the point that even if you take religiosity to refer to the external behavior, the technical rules, if you totally sever that, you totally separate that from what you call spirituality, then there's no checks and balances, because there was perhaps the most famous, quote-unquote, guru in India, tens of millions of followers, and it turned out that he was a pedophile. And some of his followers said, well, there's no problem because he's God. God can do anything. Okay? So, you can go to an extreme. You can go to an extreme where you so much put down the external part, the rules, and so much exalt spirituality that there's no qualification to be spiritual. Anyone can simply declare themselves to be spiritual, no matter what their behavior is. And you can't really say anything because as soon as you say something, well, you're just, that's just some religious hang-up. So again, I think also there's a certain, as the Greeks would say, the golden mean, the middle path. There's a sense, you found it in Nagarjuna or even the Buddha, the middle path, staying in the middle, being moderate. Don't go to extremes, don't go off the road on this side or that side. So that's another one of these perennial tensions in every culture, religiosity and spirituality.